This is Michael Osterlink. Welcome to O Radio, where we explore individual and social transformation through collaborative action. I'm a psychotherapist with a transpersonal and somatic specialization. I'm also a transpartisan social entrepreneur and head instructor at SEALFIT's Unbeatable Mind Academy. Today's show is brought to you by Somatic Psychotherapy Today, which offers a collection of articles and insights written to explore the relational realities in body-oriented psychotherapy. You can learn more about Somatic Psychotherapy Today at www.somaticcpsychotherapytoday.com. Today, our guest is Joan Davis. Hello, Joan.
Hello.
Joan is a pioneer in contemporary dance in Ireland in the 70s and 80s and has experimented with collaborative arts as a professional artist and therapist. Joan is a body-mind centering practitioner, has studied authentic movement with Janet Adler, and is a Hakomi sensory motor trauma psychotherapist. She continues her studies in the disciplines of authentic movement, developmental processes, as well as embryological and early infant trauma. She is also the author of this amazing book, Origins, a somatically based approach to our developmental and evolutionary process from preconception to standing. Good to see you, Joan.
Thank you. Thank you.
So your book is amazing, and as I kind of talked to you a little earlier, you integrate so much material. And I just have to imagine the path you took to get to the place you are. It has to be an amazing, inspirational story. So can you talk to us about, what led you on this path that eventually created this Origins, which is really a large book full of amazing information.
It weighs 2.5 kilos. So it's been a big baby, one of my bigger babies. Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of an interesting place really to start because I was married very, very young, and I had 2 of my children before the age of 22, and I found it very difficult to be at home as a mum, and in a very kind of patriarchal society where women were expected to be at home and be housewives. And I come from a Jewish background, so it felt even more patriarchal, and that one had to be the perfect housewife and all of that, So that I really struggled with that, and also the births of my children. They were challenging in their own ways. I mean, according to normal hospitalization, they were completely normal. But to me, they weren't normal. It was not normal to give birth on my back. It was not normal to be left alone, screaming in a room. It was not normal to have the baby taken away straight after birth. But I didn't know anything. And so I went along with things that I just didn't know. So it was really in my efforts to heal a lot of that all this work began. And after I had my 3rd child, when I was 29, I started dancing. And it just gave me such a powerful, Graham technique came to Dublin. And it gave me such a satisfying form of expression that it was kind of a life or death thing to get to my classes and to have that time for myself. So that's really how it all began. And then so I danced badly, but I danced for about 13 years and formed a dance company because I had started so late in life. My body was very fixed and set in its ways. So it was like if I wanted to dance, I had to create my own dance company. And that's what I did. And there wasn't much of that in Dublin at the time. In fact, there was really only ballet. And so the Arts Council gave us a little support, and things developed and grew. And then it got to the stage where I was nearly 40, and my body really, I was getting very tired, and my marriage had broken down because, again, it wasn't the done thing for a Jewish housewife to be running off to classes or choreographing or putting on performances or doing all of that. So my marriage had broken down, and then funding was taken away from all dance in Ireland. It was quite an extraordinary thing. So I was kind of left on a limb, and with a little bit of settlement from the Irish Arts Council, I decided to do Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen's Body Mind Centering. And so every summer for 4 summers, I headed off to Northampton and became immersed in for 6 or 7 weeks at a time in these different systems. And it was just extraordinary to land into that, and that your experience counted for something. It was really life-changing. And Bonnie is and still is. But then for me, it was like, my goodness, a teacher like this, that you can learn in this way, that you can be heard and respected. And again, it wasn't, that old-fashioned, I'm the authority, I know what's right for you, and this is how you learn, and this is how you do this. It was much more expanded than that. So this was just, I just felt I had dropped into heaven in some way. And I came back, and I would start teaching immediately what I had learned that summer, and using that as my case studies as well. So
actually, before you go on, if you don't mind,
yeah.
for folks who might not know about body mind centering, if you could just give us a little insight, so you have an idea of what, how you were learning to be inside of yourself.
Yes. Okay.
And why you pointed out the authority is like, it wasn't an authority telling you how to live. It's a different model. So maybe a little background on that.
Model. Yeah. Thank you. So body mind centering, as I learned it, was really about deeply coming into your own body and experiencing the different systems like bone, muscles, nerves, skin, fluids, ligaments, joints, all of the different systems in the body, and your experience was how the system in your body was expressing itself. So there might be some commonalities, like bone giving structure, or you might feel your container if you're in bone, but everybody would experience that container differently in their own unique way. And everybody's unique experience would be included. So it was really what Bonnie would call it, the mind of the system, but it was your unique mind of the system, and the beliefs that might have landed there, or the traumas that might have landed in the systems. And so it was very in depth about coming into your body to find you were your own authority, really. And that was to be believed and taken seriously.
For
so this
you,
was revolutionary to me.
Yeah, as you explored this, how did this show up as you started at the beginning of this conversation, the patriarchal society you grew up in? You happen to have a different religion, Jewish, than most, either Catholic or Protestant, Dublin. So as you begin to explore your own bodily systems from the subjective space and realizing your own authority of your own life, how does that show up in the kind of the system you're operating in when you went back home to Ireland?
Yeah. Well, it was difficult. I have to say it was difficult. And I remember teaching a class on the liver, for example, and everybody, in the class contacting their own liver and what kind of mindset went with that and had the emotions and everything. And suddenly one person stood up and said, "This is too mad. I can't stand this." It was actually a man, interestingly enough. And he said, "I've got to go." And that was it. We had to go. So that would often come in, it's too crazy for me. I can't deal with what I'm meeting in here.
Yeah.
More often it would be, "You're mad, Joan. You're teaching something that's crazy here," But then there were enough, excuse me, there were enough people who started to feel the value. Now, I have to say, very few men would come to classes, but and more women than men. Yeah. And it's still that way.
Okay, I was going to ask you, is it still that way?
Yeah, it's still that way. It's still that way. It just seems harder.
Guess why?
Well, in my experience, it seems to be more challenging for men to come into the interior space. I'm not sure why that is, but that's, there's something more vulnerable, much more vulnerable for men about doing that. So, and also doing that with a woman as your teacher is there's something incredibly vulnerable about that. Whereas women have a different physiology anyway. They are more internal often, and they're more relational. But I mean, it's a bit of a generalization, because of course that's not always true. But that's what I've experienced, that women seem to gravitate more towards community and interaction and the support of other women. But men find that maybe a little harder in some ways. Yes. So that's, and maybe men, and it's not true generally at all, but when the men who have come to this work, to me in this work, they will often have, which women have too, but a very, very strong mental, conceptual framework that they need to have in place before, and that it's hard for them to believe the information they're getting, unless they're particularly sensitive, men able to be with their sensitivity and have a creative or artistic bent. Then,
just so I'm clear, so what I hear you saying is that for some men, at least, who are drawn to the work, they had to understand it conceptually or cognitively before they step into it experientially.
Yeah.
For the most part. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, for the most part. And even then, it's hard for them to believe the information that might be coming through their bodies. Yeah.
So 4 summers of training with body mind centering. So traveling back and forth between Ireland and Massachusetts.
Yeah, I would come back each year a basket case. That's all I can say, having been immersed in 1 or 2 systems for 7 weeks. Yeah, so it would take me the whole year to actually integrate or make some sense of what I had encountered. Yeah.
You have other trainings too. So, not that you've completed body and mind centering, because I have to imagine it's a lifelong process of continual exploration. But what were some of the other things you also studied, and the relationship that you saw between these various schools of thought and practice?
Yes. Well, one of the biggest shifts was in taking the Hakomi sensory motor trauma training. And that really helped me make even more sense of all the different body systems and where trauma might have landed in the tissue. So that was amazing. I actually did that training twice because it was so tremendously healing for me to be able to come into my body, know I was in muscle, and that this muscle was holding so tightly because it needed to push something away, or it needed to reach, or it needed to motor in a particular kind of way that it had never been allowed to do or knew that it even could do. So that was really powerful. And also, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about the Hakomi method?
Yes.
How they approach trauma?
Well, they approach trauma through, now I have to think back, because that was back in 2002. And they approach it through the nervous system primarily, and the sensory, the information that comes in through your senses in a traumatic situation, where it gets stuck, and the overwhelm, and then managing that overwhelm and breaking it down into tiny pieces and titrating the work. And they would use certain, they had a lot of skills, like certain probes, things they would say that would trigger things, but also then ways of resourcing the person who was in the process. So yeah. And they also very clearly differentiated between trauma of an accident or a dental appointment or a hospitalization, and sexual abuse trauma. So that was, again, it was just really valuable to start breaking all of that down more.
Yeah. So you have body-mind centering and the Hakomi method. You have other trainings. So what other things did you get into?
I didn't do this as a complete training, but I was involved with the process-oriented psychology, POP, for many years, and they ran several trainings in Dublin over quite a long, maybe a 15-year time. And I was more part of the community, but I never fully stepped in. There was something about it that didn't quite sit for me in everything else that I was doing. And yet it included movement, it included dialogue, it included community. The world work was very powerful, yeah. So there was something very nourishing in being part of that community.
And that's the work of Amy and Arnold Mindell.
Amy and Arnie Mindell, yeah. They came once to Ireland, and that was just amazing. But to work with the master was really super, even though the other teachers were excellent as well in their own individual way. But to work with the horse's mouth, as I call it, is always special. Yeah.
I also know too that you studied authentic movement. Can you talk a little about your work there?
Yes. Well, when I started, it was interesting. This came together with the body-mind centering work. And so when I was in Northampton, like every second of your day was packed. You had lectures sort of from 8:30 in the morning until 12:30, and then there was lunch, and there was all these little workshops and meetings going on at lunch, and then you were back in for more work until about 5:36, and then you had to have sessions with people, and you had to have peer partner meetings, and it was non-stop, like for a good 12 hours every day. So it was in one of these lunchtime meetings that I was introduced to the form of and practice of authentic movement. And I just loved it, absolutely loved it. It was so, again, this space to have your own experience and to be let be in your inner world. And Bonnie had also done a form of this, but it came from Japan, and it was extremely powerful as well. I can't remember quite how we got into it, but I remember her guiding us into it one day in a seminar and it just blew fuses all over the place where the spaces one could access in oneself.
Yeah, as I mentioned to you offline, I did Don Johnson's program at CIS, in somatic psychology, and one of my teachers was Tina Stromstead, who is a student of Ann Adler.
Yeah.
And my experience is very similar. The power of spontaneous movement,
yes,
and the limitations and the emotions and the
yes,
how everything just kind of comes out.
yeah, 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 yeah. And the so I remember on the workshops with seminars with Janet that Tina was her assistant for
cool.
several years. So I got to know Tina quite well, and she actually came to Ireland, to where I live, and offered a workshop here one year. And then I think she was also working in GAP group analytic process as well. She was bringing the authentic. So yeah, so I have very fond memories of Tina. But also in that summer of the first summer of body mind centering, somebody was offering workshops where you could make art directly from the body. And that opened again a whole world for me, to paint from my bones, or to paint from my organs, or to use clay from my muscles, you know. I was, again, it was so spontaneous and immediate what would come on the page. It was quite extraordinary. It was so alive. It was so alive.
That's awesome.
So that was great. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. At the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned, you gave a conventional birth.
Yes.
It sounded like you had an intuition that something was off, like
yes,
babies are separated from you, you're on your back, the way the conventional medical system has medicalized birth, you had a kind of an intuition that wasn't right, but that's the way it was done in your society, as it is for most parts here in the States as well. And I know, that pre and perinatal psychology and health are an important part of your work.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how did you go from body mind centering to Hakomi to authentic movement, and then kind of into the pre and perinatal space?
Well, it started with Bonnie. It started in Bonnie because we worked with all the reflexes there, the very early developmental reflexes, all the developmental movement patterns, rolling, creeping, crawling, coming up to standing. There's a big arc of the developmental process from even pre-birth and in the womb and even preconception, because Bonnie always she actually would run the evolutionary development of mankind alongside the human development. I never remember those big words, what they each are called. But we had the evolutionary process of the species in a way, and we had the developmental process of the human being, where it's mirrored at different stages in the early embryology, where there's fish-like movements, or there's, all of that kind of thing. Yeah. So it really did start there. And then I just got more deeply involved in it.
Well, I find it really interesting that, that it's almost full circle. And I'm curious, as you got into kind of the embryological self-experimentation and kind of the deep dive, what did you learn about birth? Were you, because I know part of your book, you talk about kind of repatterning things. And I'm curious, did you find yourself repatterned in terms of the conventional birth that you gave to your 3 kids?
Yes.
Start doing this work, and what does that mean for you, and how did that show up in your life?
Okay. Well, what started to happen was that women were coming to see me, and a few of them became pregnant while they were coming to see me. So I took on the unofficial role of doula.
Nice.
Which is a birth companion.
Yeah.
And there was something vicarious in repatterning and actually helping them to follow their instincts in how they wanted to give birth. And at that time, it was just on the cusp of, in the maternity hospitals here, the possibility of what they call domiciliary care, where you could be at home and there might be a midwife call out to you, and then you could go into the hospital, but have a special room where they were more open to alternative ways.
Good.
So this was tremendously healing to me, to help facilitate women in giving birth. And during the program, the Origins program, in fact, 5 babies were conceived and birthed during that time.
That's cool.
I wasn't a doula to them, but because the whole program was about conception and, you know, fertilization and all these things, then it, like several people who hadn't been able to conceive before found themselves pregnant. So it was really remarkable. But that was my healing. It was through working with other people and helping them make those kinds of decisions that nourished me, because of course by that stage I certainly wasn't having any more children, or, you know, I was in menopause. I was through menopause by then. So there was something in the eldering or the grandparenting role there that was very, very healing. Yeah.
So you have these various trainings that you did, and it sounds like they're kind of interconnected. I mean, they feed into each other, they nourish each other, they support one another. But you're an integrationist. You went one step further in your new book, Origins, which is also a program I might want to point out too. You've already acknowledged. Origins is a somatically based approach to our developmental and evolutionary processes from preconception to standing. So how did you go from all this really interesting training and working with people to creating a program and then this book?
Yeah. Well, I felt, again, this is just what happens to me. I just have to do it. You know, like I just have to, there's just no question. This has to happen, or it has to be put out there. And it was overwhelming, the number of people that wanted to do this program. So it was obviously a kind of a right timing. And that was the second time in my life that had happened. The first time was when I started the dance company and I started to offer contemporary dance classes. And Fame happened to be on television, and everybody wanted to be in a leotard and tights. So it was like timing, you know, and this was and then with Origins, this was the second time that this happened. So, and meanwhile, I was exploring bringing authentic movement into performance, and that was another overlapping process. With the creation of the Origins program, because that went on for nearly 20 years, that research, and it was funded very generously by the Arts Council, and there's 2 more books about that and everything. But it was coming to a close, and I knew it was done. It was done. So then this new piece came through, and I said, these are all the pieces I feel most passionate about. How can I bring them together?
Nice. So you break your book up into 9 different sections called spirals, spiral 1 through 9. And I found it really fascinating that you chose spiral as kind of a symbol representing each of the segments of your book, because it has, you know, spiritual context. It has mathematical context to it. I mean, there's a lot of different contexts of spirals. Why spirals for you? What
Yeah.
led you to have that as kind of the symbol for your work?
Okay. Well, a spiral is something my body has always wanted to execute. The feeling of spiraling, rotating, either going down to the floor or coming back up. And I never could do it. It was never satisfactory. Also, in the birth process, spiraling happens as the baby is coming through. It's rotating and spiraling as well. So, so it was a longing for satisfaction, for physical satisfaction of that. And also, in a lot of my drawing and my artwork, I would be drawing spirals, and spirals that went into space and came back and moved. So I could sort of nearly get it on the page. And all of the figures, the little drawings in the book, they're all based on spirals.
Nice.
They're drawn through spirals. And the logo on the front of the book is a series of free-handed spirals that came for me during a very deep somatic experience in a therapy session I was having with my therapist at the time. And I just went home and I kept drawing what I had felt. And that's what eventually came out.
Wow.
So I had to call them spirals.
I can see
because it's
why.
not a linear process. It's not linear.
So as I mentioned, 9 spiral sections, 1 through 9.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to tease people, because obviously I want people to buy your book and look into your work. But can you walk me through maybe a little bit of each one of the spirals? Because it's a developmental process. You go from like conception to I'm out of the womb and I'm doing stuff.
Yeah.
I'm walking around and engaging the world. So walk us through the spirals in that way. And as you work with people through this system, what kind of systems within the body are they engaging or re-engaging? In many cases, probably engaging for the first time. If you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. Well, the first spiral 1 was like really the ground of being. So, so it took in preconception and the very early patterns before anything was formed. Like I became really fascinated. And I have to say, at the time, Spiral 1 was all over the place because it was so vast. It became so vast. We were in space, we were with air, we were with vibration. And then we came into polarity and attraction, repulsion. And it was just incredibly vast until we managed finally to get to cell and cell membrane. So that was all of Spiral 1. And then Spiral 2 I called attachment. Yeah. And that was like the bonding. What happens when we bond, when cells come together? So that's the very early time in utero. And
let me ask you about that, because you talk about developmental tasks as naval radiation.
Naval radiation, yes.
Speak a little bit about
this is a time in utero when the umbilical cord actually starts to form nearly, it's like it's the center, and the limbs organize themselves around this center. So everything radiates out. It's the starfish time. So it's linked into that. And everything radiates from the center out to the periphery and from the periphery back into the center. So it's a very, very early time when the umbilical cord is being formed and is attaching and the placenta is growing and the whole, that's a very potent and powerful time for the little one. So that spiral was very much spent in that. And we also did the heart and blood then too, because that's the heart of our relational life. So that's what fitted in there.
So when you say that you also did or do the heart and the blood, these are things you have clients who go through the system or process to explore.
Yes.
A developmental
Yes.
process along the way. Correct?
Yes, there would be guided somaticizations, which I have also got in the book. And there's an audio part of the book as well, where people can listen to those online. So there'd be a guided somaticization, and then people would have their experience, and then there'd be different methods of processing that experience and bringing it to a bit more consciousness. And then there'd be, because this was a training, there were skills-based practice sessions where people could work on each other and be guided and, given a skill set as well.
I have to imagine that the metaphysics in which you operate from suggests that there's consciousness at the very beginning of this whole
Oh, I've no doubt about that. There's intelligence. Yeah, from the word go. Yeah. And before the word go, if there is any go at all. It's
Cool. So that's spiral 2 is attachment. Spiral 3 is nourishment.
Spiral 3 was nourishment, and I took as my focal point in that the gut tube, the whole digestive tract. So that was extraordinarily powerful as well, and many. I love making up explorations. So we had some really interesting explorations around the gut tube. But it's such a delicate, tender place for so many people. And so many people experience, everybody has something around food. There's always something around food. Food, sex, and money are the 3 big things that we all have something around. So
let me ask you about the gut, because it just struck me, and I don't know if this is true in Ireland, but here in the States, there's an increasing number of people in general who have autoimmune disorders. Women in particular seem more susceptible to it. A lot of them show up in the gut. Yeah. And I'm wondering, through all these explorations that you've done with clients and practitioners, has that come up as like an issue to explore?
I don't remember that specifically coming up. It was more the process of taking in and letting go, taking in, absorbing, and letting go. And and also in each spiral, I had discovered this embryologist, Eric Blechschmidt, and he spoke to something which he called metabolic fields. And these are fields of energy in which the forming embryo is formed. So they're polarities usually, pushes, pulls, stresses, strains. But in the working of those energies on the fluid in the body, systems are formed. And so looking at those kinds of systems, like there might be a suction field or a diffusion, they call it diffusion field, it's spreading, and various different fields of energy. That was an incredibly relational piece, energetically, to bring in to see how is this tissue actually formed in utero? How did it differentiate? How did it become what it is?
I have to imagine, as you have practitioners and clients explore the different spirals and the different aspects of development that express themselves during the spirals and systems that emerge in the different spirals, that there's an intelligence within each of those systems that when your client accesses, it shifts how they relate to themselves and the world around them. Is that
That's
accurate?
absolutely true. Yes, it completely shifts how they relate to themselves and the world around them then too. Yeah, yeah.
So spiral 4 is preparation for entry into the world.
Yes. Now, spiral 4, we did, oh gosh, I can't remember. What's the system I looked at?
Connective tissue,
Pardon?
connective tissue, limbs, and
Connective
bones.
tissue and bone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this was all about the getting ready for the actual birth, and bone, and the beliefs that get laid down. I somehow was linking the bones of belief
Mm.
and where they, I mean, it's not that belief is in every system, different beliefs, but I just used bone and how it forms itself as a metaphor in a way for how beliefs layer in our psyches
Yep.
and become very hardened.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating is that they're discovering that bones are actually neuroendocrine systems.
Ah,
They
right.
actually produce hormones.
Wow. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like
That's incredible.
your self explorations or your explorations to your practitioners, to your clients,
Yes.
are now being supported, if that's
Yeah.
even necessary, by
Yeah.
physical science.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, that's good to know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then spiral 5 was birth.
Yeah.
So that was the whole spiral was just dedicated to people getting into small groups
Mhm.
and learning how to support the person who is birthing,
Mhm.
learning how to support them through the birth canal, and repatterning all that by finding out what the beliefs were that they came in with, that they took on from mom and dad or the environment, and offering them something different when they eventually were rebirthed.
Do you see, is there a nexus for perhaps with Spiral 5 and birth and something like Dr. Stan Groff's work on birth, the parametric, I think there's 4 different types of birthing processes
Yeah.
that you've seen through his earlier LSD work, but presently the holotropic
Yeah.
work. Is there a connection there?
Not, I didn't use, I mean, I did read some of his work during it just to hold that as well in the field. If something like that would come up, then I'd have a point of reference for it for the person so they could have a context.
Yeah.
But generally, it was really, what was your birth like? What would you like different?
Okay, cool. Nice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I have to imagine that people who re-experience their birth and then are given the option for a different type of birth, like psychically,
Oh,
it will also show up physiologically,
yes,
and
yes,
they shift how they are operating in the world
yeah,
as a result of that
definitely.
process.
Yeah. Because for me, this work, it's the most important thing is how you can bring this into your daily life.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the bottom line here. I don't care if you're, I mean, I'm delighted if people want to bring it into the healing professions and everything, but it's how are you when you go to the supermarket?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Nice.
Mm.
Now, Spiral 6 is
Spiral
until
6
then,
was,
so they
yeah,
finished, they're post-birth.
the post-birth, and they're coming onto land. So we did the patterns, the homologous patterns, and the frog energy, and all the reflexes that looked after, that supported that, and also the neuroendocrine system, because we're coming into the beginnings of self-formation, whatever that is.
Mhm.
So that was again very creative and very creative spiral. Well, they were all creative, but this was starting to really fire now. Yeah,
Literally.
yeah, literally. And spiral 7 then is the nervous system. So that was a huge spiral for everyone. And I had to, you know, it was hard to discern what to take, what to actually present, because you could do the whole program on the nervous system. But for me, the grounding of the nervous system is really important, and finding the balance with the fluids in the body, so that it can, because the nervous system can be very raw on its own, and also very clinical in some way. It doesn't often have emotional content. So to kind of find ways to soften that, and again the sensory and the motor, and finding where there's absence and presence in that, all of that. Yeah.
You also talk in Spiral 7 about attachment and
Yes.
transitional objects and magic, object relations.
Yes, object relations, yes.
Talk
That's a big
about
piece for me. Yeah, that's a very big piece. And that came up through the object work, really came out through my performance work. Okay. And working directly with objects of nature, and the relationship, and how to be in relationship with object in a way that brought life to the object. So so there is that whole magical piece, and there was just a most wonderful book they call The Magic Years, or The Magical Years, by Selma Freiberg, that really, when the child thinks and believes they're omnipotent, if I say this is going to happen, it happens, you know, and then the shock when it doesn't happen, and that whole developmental stage of they're not omnipotent, and how do they manage that, and how do the parents manage that, and what is needed there. So the object work came very much into that, the transitional object and attachment. Yeah. So there was attachment was a theme running through all the spirals, because it's our lives, you know, as well.
Let me ask you this. So you talked about at the very beginning that in your conventional birthing experience, your child, I don't know if it happened all 3 times, but at least one was taken from you after you gave birth. And, you know, we know from attachment theory that that's the opposite of really what you want to do in terms of triggering the mother's neurology and oxytocin and connecting with the baby and all that kind of good stuff. So when you help someone go through this process and repattern themselves, does it change the way their attachment approach to life?
I think so, really, fundamentally. I mean, at the rebirthing, it was palpable, the oxytocin in the room. You know, absolutely palpable. So, yes, so I really think it does. And relationships just shifted, you know, people would come back in with how they just were different when they went home. So yeah, definitely.
That's awesome. Have any of your practitioners ever worked with couples in that context? Like, so husband and wife, or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure, because I never did a training in couples counseling as such, or couples therapy. So I wasn't so much in a position to offer how to train people to do that.
As a trained marriage and family therapist, I think just taking what you do and bringing it inside of a couple would be, just with the individual, it's usually powerful, obviously, but I could just imagine a couple. Wow.
Well, there was one couple, because there were 2 men originally on the program, and one of those men and one of the women participants actually got together in the program, and now have a lovely 4-5-year-old boy together, and they were actually right on cue. They got together at the fertilization weekend, and then it developed slowly from that. So that baby, he was born just at the end of the program. And he got a certificate too.
And deservedly so.
Yes.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, so we've done spiral 6 and 7. 7 is perception. Spiral 8 is the flow of life.
Yes.
Part of that is developmental look at crawling patterns.
Yes.
And I'm curious, as you work with someone, and I have to imagine the various other types of trainings you did completely play a huge role in this in terms of spontaneous movement and kind of developing appropriate movement patterns based on kind of a natural expression as opposed to being forced on us by the outside world and technology and such. And I'm wondering, what have you seen in people who go through that part of your process in terms of their movement patterns and how that is for them? And what aspects of the one's psychology would you say is connected to those movement patterns that you can clearly see as you work with someone? That question makes sense.
Yes. Yes. Well, I have to say you do see it more immediately with children.
Okay.
If you work with that.
Yeah.
But the adults, like for example, it just gives a better, people feel more secure about their embodiment, about their own being in a body. They get in touch with their own agency. And the fullness of movement that can be experienced. Like crawling, to me, is one of the most exquisite spiraling patterns. And it feeds into the brain. All of these patterns pattern the brain as well. So if you really want to encourage three-dimensional thinking and whole thinking, then you really practice your crawling patterns. So you get this going backwards and forwards from right brain to left brain, and creating those pathways. So it definitely impacts different areas of the brain and brings them more online. So it's enlivening in that way.
And what I also hear you saying too is it develops a sense of greater self-trust.
Yes.
Which I would imagine leads to greater self-confidence too.
Yes, absolutely.
In time and space.
Yes. Yes, and a well-being and a sense of agency in the world. I can do this, this or whatever it is. The babies that are picked up and put standing all the time, even with the best, they're always with the best intentions of parents, but that they know how to get to standing themselves, because this is one of the key things that Bonnie really told us. The baby, the infant, has to find it in their own body. If it is done for them, then they've lost out something.
Yeah, that's one of my concerns. As you kind of started this conversation about conventional birthing and the medicalization of birth, which is a huge problem. But it seems to me that the use of technology for babies to help them stand and move and all that stuff is kind of counter to what God, spirit, or evolution, or whatever you want to frame it, intended for the development of that baby into a full, whole human being.
Yeah, I absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And Bonnie was always, she would often say, because at that time in the 91, one of the big fads was a bouncer.
Yeah.
So you'd put your baby in the door frame, and she said it's one of the worst things. It doesn't help them to find that bounce and that rebound in themselves. Yeah.
So we have one more spiral number 9.
Oh, yes.
Just a reminder to our viewing and listening audience, we're talking about Joan Davis's book, Origins, a somatically based approach to our developmental and evolutionary processes from preconception to standing. So tell us a little bit about spiral number 9.
Well, spiral 9 was where I wanted to bring in the whole authentic movement piece. And in many ways, people said, "Oh, this is like another whole training coming in here." but anyway, it had to be brought in. And because people had done so much of the developmental work in the previous 8 spirals, then they had developed for themselves a quite strong internal witness, that is the capacity to track and follow their own process. So that meant we were able to dive in more to the ground form that I had studied with Janet. And Janet was already shifting from the ground form to the discipline, what she calls the discipline of authentic movement. And it was no accident that just before the Spiral 9 began, really, I went down with pneumonia, and I was in hospital, and I knew I could not do this spiral on my own. So at that point, I asked the community of Origins students. It set up all kinds of different qualities of container to help hold the space for the authentic movement to happen. So that was no accident, and it was really fantastic. So they got to really know what it was like to hold space for the unconscious to arise, and for them to be able to start to learn what it was like to witness somebody else and to be in the presence of somebody else's process as they're tracking their own process.
Wow. So, what a wonderful gift. So we've been talking about your book, Origins, and your story, which led you to create Origins. Definitely encourage people to check out the book. It's a great read. Where can people find out more about your work, about your book, things like those?
If they go on my website, they can do that. www.gorsehill.net. And
can you spell Gorsehill?
Yeah, GORSEHILL.net, and it's all one word. And yeah, and they can order it directly from me. That's the best way to do it. Yeah.
Good. Well, I definitely encourage our viewing and listening audience to check out Joan's book, Origins, a systematically based approach to our developmental and evolutionary processes from conception to standing. Joan, it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. And look forward to hopefully meeting you someday in person.
Well, that would be great. I'd love that.
Take care.
Okay, thank you.